Under the British rule, the Indian budget was passed on the evening of the last day of February. This is because evening here meant noon in London, and that was convenient for the British Parliament. This timing continued for 50 plus years even after India became free. In 2001, Yashwant Singh shifted the timing of the budget to a much more sensible 11 am. Recently, the government shifted the budget day from the last day of February to the 1st. They also merged the national budget with the railway budget after 92 years. Therefore, इस साल का बजट 1st Feb को 11 बजे प्रेजेंट किया जाएगा। हर बजट में कुछ सिमिलैरिटीज होती हैं और कुछ डिफरेंसेस। Here are some factors that all budgets talk about: the GDP growth rate, agricultural output, industrial output, the performance of the service sector, updates on health, updates on education, foreign trade policy, national defense, capital markets reform, and so on. Let's look at these factors one by one. Every finance minister talks about the GDP growth rate. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and it's the number that everyone from TV news to the opposition party cares the most about. GDP shows the rate at which a country is growing. If the production and consumption of goods and services increases in a country, its GDP increases. Therefore, an increasing GDP means the country is producing and consuming more, a sign of growing wealth and prosperity. Let's move on to the second item on the list: agricultural output. Agriculture is central to a country's food security. In the 1960s, India had to survive on imported food. After the Green Revolution, we became self-reliant and went on to become among the biggest exporters of agricultural produce. The finance minister, on budget day, gives the nation an update on last year's agricultural output and also shares projections for the next year's crop. Industrial output is important as well. Industrial growth is what turns developing countries into developed countries. Everyone also awaits updates about the service sector. As you can see, the service sector contributes close to 60% of the national GDP, and this ratio will only increase in the future. The finance minister also gives updates on the health sector. As you can see, India doesn't invest as much as other countries in health services. Moving on, the budget speech also makes a note of the education sector, the recent advances, and the future challenges. In the 21st century, a nation's destiny depends on the quality of its workforce, and the quality of a country's workforce depends on the quality of its education. While India has made good advances on the primary education front, many gaps remain to be filled in the higher education space. Moving on, the budget speech also talks about the foreign trade policy and updates the country about changing FDI and import-export rules. When the FDI cap on a sector increases, it means that sector can now seek and obtain more foreign capital. This is typically a positive sign for the sector, as more investments mean more growth. The import-export regulation also determines whether Indian goods will be competitive in the global market or not. हर बजट स्पीच में डिफेंस सेक्टर का जिक्र तो होता ही है. Without national security and the geopolitical stability that comes from it, economic and social progress are not possible. The Indian budget allocates funds for the Indian defense sector that are around 2.5% of the national GDP. The budget speech also talks about the capital markets and the evolving rules around them. Retail investors को स्टॉक मार्केट की तरफ आकर्षित करने के लिए गवर्नमेंट कैपिटल गेन्स टैक्स को कम कर सकती है. Because of the capital markets, dormant money becomes active and helps the country become more productive. This is why the government tries to simplify investment regulations while making sure the interests of the investors are protected. In the budget speech, the finance minister also mentions the government's projected expenditure and projected revenue for the upcoming year. Did you know, in India, the budget comes into force only after it's passed by the House? The budget presented on 1st Feb becomes active 2 months later, on 1st April. This is because in India, the financial year ends on 31st March, till which point in time the previous budget is applicable. हर बजट में कॉमन फीचर्स होते हैं, पर हर बजट में कुछ यूनिक बातें भी होती हैं. For example, the 2017 budget was important as it was the first budget after the demonetization of old 500 and 1000 rupee notes. The 2018 budget was important as it was the first budget after the introduction of the Goods and Services Tax Act, that is GST. Similarly, this year's budget will be important as it will be the first budget after the COVID-19 pandemic hit our country. India was one of the world's fastest growing major economy before COVID-19, but in 2020, our economy also shrank the most. In Q2 2020, for example, the Indian economy contracted by 23.9%. This was the sharpest global contraction and the worst quarterly number since India started sharing the numbers since 1996. The 2021 budget will have to face the challenge head-on. This budget will also focus a lot more on health than usual. In 2020, India, along with the rest of the world, went through a deadly pandemic. As the vaccinations start, the Finance Minister will also talk about other steps in terms of therapeutics and vaccine distribution that will help India end the pandemic faster. Dear viewers, क्या आपको पता है कि बजट शब्द का ओरिजिन फ्रेंच वर्ड बूजे से हुआ है, जिसका मतलब है एक लेदर ब्रीफकेस. ब्रिटिश ट्रेडिशन के अनुसार इंडिया का बजट पार्लियामेंट तक एक लेदर ब्रीफकेस में लाया जाता था. In 2019, the Indian Finance Minister brought the budget documents to India in a traditional Bahi Khata. Here's an interesting change that will be observed on this year's budget day. The budget won't be physically distributed to the members of parliament. This year, due to health concerns, the budget will be electronically distributed to all MPs. This is the first time since 1947 that the physical copies of the budget won't be distributed. Because of COVID-19, technology adoption has gone up in the economy, in education, in healthcare. And now, COVID is leading technology adoption in politics too. Union government के बजट के साथ एक और कस्टम अटैच्ड है, हलवा सेरेमनी. हलवा सेरेमनी में फाइनेंस मिनिस्ट्री के स्टाफ को हलवा खिलाया जाता है और फिर 10 दिन तक बजट प्रिंटिंग प्रेस में बंद कर दिया जाता है. 10 दिन के बाद जब सारे बजट डॉक्यूमेंट्स प्रिंट हो जाते हैं, तब बजट का प्रेजेंटेशन होता है और मिनिस्ट्री स्टाफ बाहर आता है. इस बार बजट का फिजिकल प्रिंटिंग नहीं होगा, पर शायद कस्टम के अनुसार हलवा सेरेमनी को फाइनेंस मिनिस्ट्री स्किप नहीं करेगी. Let's recall what we learned in this video. There are some factors that all budget documents cover. For example, the GDP growth rate, agricultural output, industrial output, the performance of the service sector, updates on health, updates on education, foreign trade policy, national defense, capital markets, reform. The finance minister has noted that this year's budget will be like no other because this will be the first budget presented after a pandemic. The finance minister has also encouraged people to share a wish list of what they want from the budget. Therefore, the finance minister is trying to stay ahead of the nation's expectations by crowdsourcing suggestions. This year's budget is likely to see an increased focus on healthcare, telemedicine, vaccine distribution, economic recovery, and providing support to small businesses. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe. In the comment section below, tell us the topics on which you'd like to see videos.
Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.